Welcome back to the LS Community Church podcast. Woo woo. We are here in Lee Summit, Missouri, and Lee Summit Community Church is all about making disciple makers who saturate Lee Summit with the gospel. I'm Kevin Hartman. I'm the discipleship pastor here, and this is Stan Rodda, our lead pastor.
And I'm here too.
Yes, you are.
And I'm happy to be here.
Hey, it's been a month since we've been behind the mic in this format doing these story session podcasts. A lot's happened.
A lot has happened.
Like we have a pretty resilient football team.
We have an undefeated football team that should be like 5-4 by now, probably, but somehow at least as of the recording, they're still undefeated. They should have lost a couple of times.
Finding new ways, inventing new ways to win football games. Yep,
inventing a way to win all the time.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's crazy. I can't take it.
Yeah, and then. I don't know. We had this election thing.
I forget.
That happened.
The whole nation got involved. It got a little awkward.
A lot of people voting. Yeah. On a serious note. So we're watching this post Thanksgiving, and we hope that you and your families have been able to unite around the table, have good conversations of unity, of love, of coming together for all the right reasons. And not finding reasons to divide. Yeah. And we've got a season ahead of that, through all the holidays. So hopefully that continues.
It's definitely going to be a challenge for a lot of people. I mean, at least from what I've seen. So hopefully by this time, families will have found a way to have some unity in all of this. That'll be the hope and the prayer. So,
Yeah. And of all people, we as followers of Jesus need to lead the way with that, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, so we are here in the story. We've finished Act 1 in the story. So let me pause for just a second.
Yep.
If you're new to the podcast, you may not know what we're talking about with the story. What we're talking about is a series that we're going through here at Lee Summit Community Church that are 31 stories from Scripture that we believe help build the grand narrative of all 66 books of the Bible.
Yep.
They lead us to the core understanding of why we have this library called the Bible. So we have just finished what we're calling Act 1, which we titled Once Upon a Time.
Yep.
And that took us from creation all the way through the wanderings of the Israelites.
People starting to wander around the wilderness and 10 Commandments and all that.
Yep. So we finished that series. Now we're launching into Act 2 of the story. And we've called this Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. Here we go.
I love. So I just can't go any further. Give us like the minute and a half reason why we landed on that title. We were talking about this earlier. I thought it was really good.
Partly because it's a name that people who are just out and about would recognize, and it might pique interest and go, how does a church preach on the Game of Thrones?
Right,
that's not a real Christian's show,
Right.
So it piques a little bit of interest, which I think is fun. But as we head into Act 2, where we're actually going is a period of time, about 500, maybe a little over 500 year stretch of history where Israel they go in and out of some really dark times. They go in and out of different types of government and how they're going to be led and structured. They have a plethora of leaders who step up, some of them good, some of them bad. So if you were familiar with Game of Thrones, it was these kingdoms, and there was always this kind of jockeying for position of who's in charge. And that's kind of what we see happen. You read through the Judges. There's all these guys and ladies also who have tried to lead Israel to where God would have them. But by the end, it's, Israel did whatever they wanted. They did whatever was right in their own eyes. Like now all of a sudden they're in charge, and then it gets bad again. And, God's constantly having to intervene for them. And so it was kind of a fun way to play on a cultural thing many people are aware of. But also at the same time, you do see some similarities in this 500-ish year period of time for Israel as they're trying to figure out who's in charge around here anyway, who is sitting on the throne of Israel, who's ultimately in charge.
For sure. So 500, 550-ish years.
Somewhere in there,
Beginning with Joshua.
Yep.
the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua, entering into the land of Canaan, the promised land,
over
establishing a homeland, building cities and homes and permanent. They've been living nomadically. Now they're at home, so to speak, and beginning to establish a national presence there in the land of Canaan. So we go from that point, and we're going to progress in Game of Thrones all the way to Solomon and the consecration of this thing called temple. The house of God, the resting place of the presence of God with Israel. So let's talk through some of this. We've got several weeks, several weeks, I think 7 weeks, if I'm correct.
7 weeks.
So take us through those weeks, some big ideas, big themes, and we'll circle back and talk about a few details there.
Yeah. Well, one of the first things I wanted to say for people who are watching this, whenever you finally get around to it and you're participating in the series and whatnot, as you read, one of the interesting things that's jumped out at me is how the Kings, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and the Chronicles, they all tell basically the same story for the most part with a few varying details. In that way, it reads almost like the Gospels. So if you go to the Gospels and you read the story of Jesus, you're reading it from 4 different perspectives of different followers and different people they're writing to. And so you get different stories, you get different angles, you get different perspectives from different followers of Jesus. It's interesting because Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles does the same. It's telling the same story from a similar period of time, but it's got a slightly different perspective. So as you read through, this is why it's important to actually read all of those in their entirety, because then you get the different perspectives on the story. But when you get to the Chronicles, for instance, there's a really heavy focus on Judah specifically. And within that, also, Chronicles, interestingly, leaves out the whole Bathsheba story with David. So when you read Chronicles, David comes across like overwhelming, smashing success kind of a thing. And then you go back and read the Samuels and the Kings, and you go,
wait, is this the same guy? What's going on?
David has some problems,
Yep.
kind of thing. But it's interesting because they're different perspectives telling different pieces of that story so that their listeners can have that broad perspective of who these people were, the history of the people of Israel, and you get a slightly different perspective. So it's just kind of a fascinating read through. It's also a weird read because you'll go from book to book to book and you'll be like, I feel like I just read this. And the answer is yes, you did. You pretty much read that exact same thing, just a slightly different perspective. But anyway, big ideas, big ideas. So 7 weeks of big ideas. So as we head into this chapter 7, our big idea that week is that God calls us to remember his faithfulness. And what we're going to do there is we're going to talk through the story of Joshua. And there's some really neat stuff that God does with Joshua, calling him to set up altars that help people to remember God's faithfulness as God is establishing his dominion, creating this nation, establishing himself with these people. So there's a really interesting thing there about being called back to remember God's faithfulness. And then in chapter 8, it's really where we start to unpack the judges. When we get there on a Sunday, we'll probably just spend time with one probably and really dive into their story. But chapter 8 is where God's pursuit invites us to be a part of the mission. And the judges are interesting because God just pulls almost what feels to us like random characters who now all of a sudden are leading a nation of people, and they have no intention of being that person. And so there's this kind of invite into being a part of the mission of God. And so God's pursuit of his creation invites you and me to be a part of his mission. Chapter 9 is where we hear the story of Ruth. And it's just a great story. Ruth is just a really great story. But our big idea that week is that God's pursuit of his creation extends to foreigners and immigrants. So the story of Ruth is one of a Moabite woman who makes her way into the people of Israel with Naomi. So she's an immigrant into the nation, and yet she's going to become the great grandmother of David, and Jesus is going to show up through this lady. And so it's like God invites all kinds of people immigrants and foreigners, even to be a part of the mission of God. Chapter 10 is where we actually see that God still pursues us even in our disobedience. There's this story with King Saul, and man, he just blows it big time. And Samuel's like, listen, God's done with you. You've blown it. Like, he's rejected you as king. And yet in those last few years God keeps giving him opportunities. He has a chance to right the ship. But God continues to pursue us even in our disobedience. And we'll have the next two chapters are on David, a young David, and then King David. And the big ideas there are that God pursues us through faithful people. Young David is an extremely faithful character, obedient, does all the right things. King David has a few problems and, makes some mistakes, and God still pursues even through the faithfulness of David and the unfaithfulness of David. And so we're going to wrestle through that. And the last one, as we wrap up Game of Thrones, is King Solomon, chapter 13. And there we're going to learn that God is pursuing his creation so he can dwell with us. Finally, after years and years of wandering, years of trying to build a nation, years of a tabernacle where God's presence is kind of in this temporary tent that they can pack up and move, and God's presence goes with and leads the way and all that. King Solomon builds a temple, and God's presence now resides in this place. And the temple is where God's presence comes to earth and God can be with his people. It's kind of an image of what God is doing in the Garden of Eden, where he walks and talks with Adam and Eve. He's moving back toward reestablishing that, as we see in the story. And then ultimately, we'll eventually get to the story of Jesus, who is named Emmanuel, God with us, and we will see God's ultimate act of pursuing his creation to dwell with them. But as Game of Thrones ends, Solomon's going to settle in. He's going to build a temple, and you're going to have this kind of idea of this is what God's going for. God is trying to get to that place where heaven can be on earth, and he can be with his people, and they can be with him. And that's kind of how this part of the series will wrap up.
Just taken back as we talk through this in a little more detail about the ways, the modes, the people, the ways in which God pursues. Oh man, we look at all the characters, the 12 different judges you pointed out, how different they were. Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit about the cycle of disobedience of people and coming back to God, and that cycle just going, and he continues to pursue. He never gives up.
Yep. Don't you get to preach on Ruth though? That's like a positive one, right?
Yes, it is. And it
let's
really,
start there. Let's start positive.
Let's do that. I love this. So it almost, you kind of look at this book in the middle of these 550 years and go, where
did this come from?
What does this have to do?
Feels very out of place
with this section, this theme of Game of Thrones and power and all of this. Because really it's the book is about a widow, an immigrant, and a future king.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned Naomi, and so she's married to Elimelech, and there's a famine. They're from Bethlehem. They're Jews, and they have to leave Bethlehem because of this famine, and they search for a place to survive, and they go to Moab of all places, which has been historically an enemy of the Jewish people and not a hospitable place for them to land, but that's where they end up because they're in survival mode. And while they're there with their two sons, through this 10-year period of time, Elimelech dies. The two sons marry Moabite women, and they die. And so not one, but three widows, and the life of a widow was a tough one. Yeah. It is today. It was certainly a tough one then.
Yeah.
So here we have Naomi, who has no roots, no connection to Moab, and she wants to go back home naturally, which any of us would want to do. So she packs up and she says, daughters-in-law, stay. These are your people. You stay here. I'm going back home.
Yeah.
One says, okay, I'm staying. The other, Ruth, says, I'm going with you. Not only does she say, I'm going with you, but she says, I'm going with you. Wherever you go, I go. Your people will be my people. And she says, your God will be my God.
Yep.
So Ruth essentially gives up all that she knows, all that she has to pursue a life with Naomi. Why? Probably lots of different reasons. We don't have lots of details on why she made that determination, but it's kind of akin to Abraham getting this call, and we don't hear about an audible call for Ruth, but Abraham picking up and leaving and just and going. And so we have Ruth picking up with Naomi and going back to the unknown. She has no idea where she's going, no job, no husband to care for her. She just commits in this extremely loyal way to her mother-in-law.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of loyalty in three different ways that we see played out in the book of Ruth. One is Ruth's loyalty to her mother-in-law. The next loyalty we see this, we would think of it as this chance meeting between Ruth, who goes to find food, in a guy named Boaz's field. And Boaz is loyal to the Torah, being the deeply religious man he is. He leaves the edges of his field for the poor, which they're instructed to do in Deuteronomy, I think it's 24 and 25. So he leaves the edges. Ruth goes to graze in the field, to glean in the field, and recovers food. She's recognized by Boaz. And long story short, Boaz ends up redeeming Naomi's line by marrying Ruth, which is also a part of the Torah. He's a kinsman. He's supposed to take on this line and redeem this line for Naomi. So there's this deep sense of loyalty on Boaz's part to the Torah. He does exactly as God has instructed him to do. As a kinsman, and so we recognize he's called the kinsman redeemer. He redeems this line. And then as the story concludes, they have a son, and there's this paragraph right at the end of the book that spells out the lineage of Boaz and Ruth. And it just so happens that Boaz and Ruth are the great grandfather and great grandmother of King David.
Yeah.
So God's loyalty to the pursuit of his creation is recognized very clearly in this book. And he uses an immigrant woman, brought her back through Naomi and the tragedy that they endured, brings them back to Bethlehem and meets Boaz. And here we have King David. And we know, because Boaz was from Judah. David from Judah. Who else? Several generations later.
Yeah, there's this other guy.
Named
blanking on the name. Yeah.
Jesus Christ, who was born as a result of God bringing Boaz and Ruth together. So it's a beautiful story of God's pursuit and his loyalty to his pursuit through this upside down story. It's amazing.
And even the connection back to Bethlehem, not even all, I mean, just even down to this tiny, some commentators have said basically what amounts to a small redneck town, like just in the backwoods,
bunch of shepherds,
There's nothing there.
Right.
And you have this, what feels in the middle of Game of Thrones, almost this random story of Ruth. And then this tie-in later that you can't miss, right?
Yeah.
And I think I'm still convinced this is the benefit to the story, because you can go through a sermon series on Ruth and learn a lot of cool things. You can go through a sermon series on Jesus's birth and learn a lot of cool things, and all that's great. But then to periodically zoom out and go, how do all these dots connect? Yeah. And then to start piecing them together and going, oh my goodness, like it is just all connected. Like God is constantly at work.
Yeah.
Pursuing his creation, and you can just see it. So, yeah.
Boaz excuse me, Boaz is a beautiful foreshadowing of the kinsman redeemer, Jesus.
Yep.
Comes to redeem us.
Yep. It's this little light right in the middle of what can be a very dark time in Israel's history.
Beautiful story
with the judges and the kings. And it's just kind of a mess, literally, like who's in charge and who's running the show.
Right.
And then you've got this random little 4-chapter book of Ruth, and you just feel a sense of light in the midst of all the darkness that's happening in the history at the time.
Yeah. So when we, when we get to chapter 9 on Sunday, we're going to unpack some more of the seemingly everyday mundane ways that God works and the way the people that he uses to fully understand how he's delivering his story of pursuit of his creation.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited for that.
Yeah.
But some beautiful loyalty themes there. And this story falls in the middle of this 400-year period of judges. And so as a little transition from Ruth to what's going on here in the Judges, which you're speaking through quite a bit.
Yep.
What draws your attention?
I mean, there's some really interesting things that draw my attention. Part of it is just the people that God chooses to be a part of the mission to try to make things right. But I think one of the interesting things that we're going to see is we're going to see the beginning of a cycle that the people of Israel play out over and over and over and over. You will see this through the rest of the Old Testament. Just watch them walk right into it. And it doesn't matter how many times they've been warned. Doesn't matter how many times they've had to be rescued. They just walk right back into it. And depending upon who you're reading and what chart you look at and all that kind of stuff, you get some slightly different wording. But basically, the gist of all of it is this. The people of Israel fall into a pattern of sin or disobedience. And then as soon as they do that, they meet the consequence of that, which is oppression. They end up being enslaved. We're going to meet judges at times that God raises up because they are being oppressed by the Midianites, the Amalekites. Along the way in the story, they're going to be oppressed by the Philistines eventually. They're going to lose the Ark of the Covenant. They're finally going to get that right, and then they're going to be okay for a little while, and then they're going to fall into sin and back into oppression, and then Babylon's going to show up. And it just continues over and over and over. But where you see this cycle begin is right here in Judges, in this particular section where this whole theme begins. When they get into oppression and slavery and there's things are going bad, they always end up in a place of repentance. God raises someone up to show up and call them back. So you see a lot of weeping with the people of Israel during these seasons. Lamentations, there's a whole book about it, Jeremiah, you have these prophets who are trying to lead the people, calling them back to repentance. They're crying out to God to make things right again. And God raises up leaders to lead them out in this thing. And then through those people, God will now deliver them, make things right. And this is just a cycle they're going to get into: sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance. And they're just going to do it over and over and over. And so that's one of the really interesting themes that's going to come out of the book of Judges. Now, I'm going to probably spend more time walking through Gideon specifically, as God invites this really interesting character, Gideon, to be a part of the one who's kind of leading the people to try to set things right. And it's just an interesting dynamic of who Gideon is, the youngest in his family, the least in his clan, the least in his tribe, the least. I mean, of all the unassuming dudes in the Bible you'd think was going to lead Israel out of oppression, he is your last pick. I mean, this is not the guy you choose.
It's funny because the image I had as a little kid going to Sunday school was this conquering hero,
crazy warrior running down the hill with a sword.
I only need a couple hundred guys. Just let's go. We're gonna.
Dude was terrified.
He was.
It takes him 2 consecutive days of just straight up testing God. I'm not going anywhere until you do this.
Yeah,
The dude is freaking out.
Yes.
And it's just interesting to read through there and to see, even though there's kind of this, like, who's in charge? And then at the end of the Judges, the people do whatever's right in their own eyes. And at the end of the day, even through this cycle, you get to the end and you go, God is very firmly in charge. Mm-hmm. God is very firmly sovereign. He's got this. He's going to raise people up. He's going to deliver. But man, if we could just learn how to be faithful and obedient, so we didn't have to learn these lessons, that would probably be good.
It also screams, hey, my mission is not propelled through your strength, your power, your might.
Yeah.
It's by my ability. Yeah. It's by the way I choose to do it. That's how it's going to happen. Yep. So, to your point about Gideon, none of us, if we were God, is picking Gideon to propel our mission.
Yeah, it feels like a weird choice, from a human perspective. And you can say that on almost any number of these. When David gets picked, it's like he's the runt of the family. Like he's out in the field. He doesn't know how to lead an army, and God just continually. And it's part of the point that I'd really like to bring out that week, especially in the Judges, is that as soon as you start to say to yourself, well, God could never use me. I don't know enough. I never went to Bible college. I'm not, and you start to make that kind of excuse of like, well, I'm not this, so I can't do what God wants. The reality is God could tap you on the shoulder and be like, no, you're in, and he's going to use you for his purposes and invite you to. Here's the mission. Come be a part. Yeah. And all of us are called to be a part of that. So it's just it's just a fascinating history and part of how Israel lives that out.
Yeah. So we see this cycle over and over, this cycle of returning to God, recommitting, then falling back into sin, and why? What are some contributing factors to this? What's kind of going on behind the scenes?
Some of the contributing factors are really just, part of it, to be fair, is to say part of it's just human nature. Part of it's human nature to go, you know what? I want to be my own God. You can literally read the fall in Genesis 3, and that is basically what the temptation is. The temptation to eat the fruit is, God was wrong. You can be just like him. You don't have to do what he says. Mm-hmm. And so the temptation is for the human to be like God, to be the one calling the shots. And so you do see that in humanity to some degree. You have judges that are really bad, kings that are really bad, and when they come to power, they get a feel for what that's like. And then the flesh kind of takes over and they pursue things they shouldn't. And so in reality, that's part of it. The interesting piece is the idolatry piece. And I think in 2024, when we think about idolatry, we think about idolatry more in terms of like, don't worship money, don't worship power, don't worship, whatever these kind of ethereal almost type things are that are floating out there. But the reality is in the Middle East and even earlier in history in the ancient Near East, like the reality is that there is a pantheon of little gods floating around that the people worshiped. They were very superstitious. So like even when, a few weeks back when we met Abraham, God plucks Abraham out of Ur. What's Abraham doing? He's not, reading the Bible. He's worshiping the moon. It's like, that's what these people did. And then you track Abraham and the family, and you get to Joseph, and then Joseph, they're in Egypt, and then they're in Egypt for 400 years. And at this point, Israel is not a nation, just Hebrew people. But there's no nation, there's no tabernacle, there's no temple, there's no Ark of the Covenant, there's no sacrificial laws, there's nothing. They are slaves. And while they are there, being a part of Egyptian culture in this way, they're not worshiping Yahweh, they're just worshiping all the other pantheon of gods that Pharaoh's worshiping and the Egyptians are worshiping. And so you get 400 years of that. Call it indoctrination if you want, or call it, kind of almost like a fear or superstition or whatever. And you have 400 years of that built into your blood. You leave, you're wandering around the wilderness, you're starving, and you're like, well, the gods back there at least fed us.
Yeah.
And when you think of it in those terms, it all of a sudden becomes a little bit easier to understand how quickly the Hebrew people could go, I'm not sure Yahweh is strong enough to do this. It feels like we had it better over here. Mm-hmm. And so in that idolatry cycle, what you'll see is literally the people of Israel through the whole Old Testament wrestling to some degree with almost a polytheistic kind of worldview. As soon as they fall, they go back to Baal, they go back to Asherah, they go back to Chemosh, they go back to Moloch. Just as soon as they fall, they go right back to some false god.
Well, they're there in Egypt. They observed the plagues, just like the Egyptians did. Yeah. There were things going on. There were the Pharaoh's magicians performing
supernatural, miraculous acts. How did they do that?
What is going on here? Yep. And it not that we're suggesting that it leads us down this path where we doubt whether the Hebrew God, Yahweh, is truly God supreme.
King of kings, Lord of lords.
We're not questioning that. We're simply saying there's this cultural influence.
There's a significant cultural, superstitious influence that permeated them for hundreds and hundreds of years, that when you try to put yourself, it's easy now, a little bit easier now in 2024. We read the story and we go, I don't think I would have made that mistake. Yeah. I think I would have chosen better. The reality is when you put yourself in that position with the same dynamics, the centuries of thinking and oppression and all of that stuff, the reality is you wouldn't. You would be just like the people. And so that's where you have that interesting dynamic of God having to raise up someone out of the midst of all of that, who are all thinking the exact same thing and it's all wrong. And God has to raise someone up. Deborah, get up there and lead the way. Yeah. Gideon, get up there and do your job. Samson, go save the people. Saul, get in there and do your job. And he just constantly picking people to call them back out of that idolatry, to lead them to repentance so that God can deliver them to who they need to be. And it's just a cycle you will see through the entire Old Testament. Yeah.
They needed a few resets along the way.
Yep.
Wandering through, wanting to go back and might be a reason why Moses delivered. God gave Moses the commands and it's
I was having this discussion with my community group around this exact same topic, because it's easy to say, well, would we have done what the Israelites did? Would we have made the same mistake? And wouldn't we have figured it out? And how could they not know? You see God part the Red Sea. How do they not know? And so maybe we would have made better choices. And I'm like, I bet if each one of us thought hard enough, we could all come up with a sin cycle in our own lives we don't like, where we return to something that is not as good as God. Mm-hmm. And then we come back to God and we say, oh yeah, I'm sorry. I can't believe I'm having to say sorry for that again.
Yeah.
And then you get back on track for a while and then you do it again. Oh God, I'm sorry. I totally forgot about that. And you repeat the cycle. We repeat the cycle. The difference is we're not going back to a sacrificial system or having to deal with oppression of another people group, where if we mess up, the Babylonians are going to storm in, or the Egyptians or whatever. We're dealing with it on the other side of the cross. But the reality is we still have our own version of the cycle that we have to wrestle with. And so if you put yourself in that particular context, I don't think it should be a hard leap for us to say, I would have been right there with them.
Yeah.
I get it. I see why they're wrestling with this. It's actually not that far. It makes sense how they got there.
Yeah. We talked about this on Sunday a few weeks ago with Joseph, that the human heart is extremely deceitful and desperately incurable.
Yeah.
there's only one answer to the deceit of the heart, and that's the kinsman redeemer, Jesus.
Yep.
And just that reminder again that that the culture can influence us much more than we're probably willing to admit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else?
I mean, we're gonna talk through King Saul. We're gonna have a couple of weeks with David, a week with Solomon. I mean, there's some really good stuff coming up in the next few weeks. And to be honest, especially with David, these are some core foundational moments that will set up the Messiah. And so if you're a part of what we're doing, and you're looking ahead at your calendar going, I need to be gone a couple of weeks. I don't recommend being gone Saul, David, and Solomon. Like, you want to be here those weeks because they are foundational to much of what we still hold true today, even with Jesus. So
absolutely.
Those are big ones.
All right. And that's how we're going to close out Game of Thrones, Act 2.
Up to Solomon. Yep.
Yeah.
Act 2.
Yeah. All right. Well, Stan, thanks for joining us tonight for
absolutely
for our podcast. And thank you for watching. We really appreciate you participating with us through the story. Like and subscribe, share the podcast with your friends. And as Stan said, we'd love to see you on Sunday morning, which, by the way, we have something new coming. We have a couple of gathering times now, not just one.
Don't show up at 10.
Don't show up at 10.
You're going to start missing it.
Unless you're coming in for breakfast before the 11 o'clock, right? Yeah, some Ron's famous breakfast burritos. Those are awesome. So our gathering times on Sunday, beginning December 1st and moving forward, are 9:15 and 11 o'clock. Both identical services with community kids stuff going. And same message and worship and music upstairs. So we hope that you join us as we continue our series through the story. Again, like and subscribe, share. Thanks so much for being a part. We'll see you next time.